to this country girl talk to you this evening. So I am Ramona Trevino. I am a wife, I'm a mother, I'm a grandmother, I'm a stepmother. I have a bunch of titles. But I'm recently the Director of Outreach with 40 Days for Life. So I'm kind of one of their newest members. I just began in June of last summer. So I'll celebrate a year with 40 Days this June. I started and accepted my position 9 days before the overturning of Roe. Praise be to God. Had no idea what was in store, right? And so it's a tremendous blessing to not only be a part of 40 Days for Life National, but to be here this evening, to be able to share with you, and really just witness to the power of prayer. For me, this is a very emotional time of the year because I will celebrate 12 years of being free of Planned Parenthood this May. I left May 6th of 2011, so I'll be celebrating 12 years of being free from Planned Parenthood this May. And so my conversion happened over the course of about 5 months, but it was the result of prayers from the 40 Days for Life campaign that opened up the floodgates and gave me the grace to be able to take that final leap of faith and leave Planned Parenthood for good. And that was during the Living campaign of the spring of 2011. So just to kind of give you a little bit of background about me, I was baptized as a Catholic. We were what you would call cultural Catholics. We weren't really practicing Catholics. My parents were married in the Catholic Church, baptized my sister and me. And that was probably the extent of our faith formation. We probably know a lot of people like that. But, the occasional Christmas, Easter, maybe a wedding or a funeral is probably the only times I ever attended Mass. So no surprise, I was pregnant at 16. I actually still live in my hometown of a population probably less than 1,500 people. I live in a little rural town about an hour northeast of Dallas. So when I became pregnant at 16, you can imagine, it wasn't necessarily a big scandal, but it was scandalous for our small town because everyone knows everybody. And I wasn't probably the first girl to become pregnant, but I was the first girl to go to school pregnant. And so it was, I was probably the source of a lot of talk in our town. But by the grace of God, and I look back in hindsight, I realized what a grace this was, abortion never crossed my mind. It was completely unthinkable and inconceivable. And praise be to God, it was also inconceivable for my parents. So they never once considered abortion. Sadly, the father of my daughter wanted me to have an abortion, but thankfully, I also said no to that. But sadly, he subjected me to years of abuse, and I think probably because he resented me for having my daughter. But thank God, he gave me the courage to face single motherhood and move on with my life and leave that difficult and abusive relationship. And a few years later, I would meet my now husband of 16 years, and we were confirmed, we entered the church, we got married in the church, and then just a little while after, I accepted a position for Planned Parenthood. And people always ask, Ramona, how did you end up at Planned Parenthood? And I think the answer is probably the same answer that so many people say is, I don't know. I don't know. It's one of those things where you're inside there, you're working there, and you ask yourself, how did I end up here, right? And I think if I really sit down and I think about it, and I've had a long time to think about it, I think there's a few reasons. One, I was naive. Two, I was ignorant of who this organization really is and what they're about. For me, Planned Parenthood was not synonymous with abortion. For people who are in pro-life, involved in pro-life, they say Planned Parenthood, you say Planned Parenthood, they know abortion. For me, it was synonymous with health care, right? Women's health care. And that's the lie that so many of us buy into. And so that was part of it. I think another part was Satan finds a way to capitalize on our pain and our suffering. And I had been through a lot of trauma, and I hadn't dealt with it, and I hadn't healed from it, and I suppressed it. And I feel as though that led me to this way of thinking that I was helping other girls and helping them to be preventing abortions and preventing pregnancy and helping prevent them from being in a similar situation that I found myself in when I was a teen. That's part of it. And And I think really I was of the mentality that so many of us in America share with, is that, you know, I personally wouldn't have had an abortion, but I wasn't going to tell another woman what she could or could not do, right? That she had a right to choose. And I didn't really think about what that meant, because you grow up in a world, in a country where you're subjected to this propaganda day in and day out, that this is about choice. This is about reproductive freedom. This is about abortion being safe, legal, and rare. You know, you hear that over and over and you buy into that lie. You never really stop to consider what that word choice means. What are they choosing? So if a woman is coming into these facilities and she's saying, you know, I want a pregnancy test, for example, and that's what I remember my very first referral, and the first person that I performed a pregnancy test on, and she wanted a referral for abortion. I never really stopped to consider the choice that she was making. And so when she walked out that door with that abortion referral in her hand, I washed my hands of the whole situation. And I always say, like Pontius Pilate, I just washed my hands. And I put it on her. And I said, you know, this is her choice. This is between her and God, if she believes in God. I have nothing to do with this. This is about her freedom, her rights. My hands are clean. And that's really how I justified working for Planned Parenthood. I justified, you know, I ignored any type of culpability that I may have had in terms of being culpable for these abortions. The other reason I rationalized was because we were a referral facility. I justified based on the fact that we were a referral facility. So actual abortions didn't happen under our roof. They happened in Dallas. So we referred all the women to a different location. We were the same affiliate, but under two different titles. And because I referred them somewhere else and it wasn't happening under my roof, I said, well, you know, it's happening over there. I work in the side of the business, the good part, right? The good part where we prevent and we help and we do all these good things, right? Supposedly. But I quickly realized that I wasn't helping women. I was exploiting children. Because the majority of our women were not adult women. They were young girls as young as 12, 13, 14 years old who were already living a promiscuous lifestyle. And oftentimes we saw cases of statutory rape that we ignored. We didn't want to know the ages of their sexual partners because that required us to report. And we didn't want to have to do that. And so I don't know how many times young girls came in without their parents, because they didn't have to have parental consent, to obtain birth control and to be sent out right back into the arms of probably their abusers. And that was something that was weighing on my heart, because I had teenage girls at home and I was preaching one thing at home and doing something. And that was weighing heavy day in and day out, and I tried to ignore it. I tried to suppress those feelings. Until one day, God began to plant the seed that would be the catalyst that would ultimately lead me out of Planned Parenthood. And that seed was actually planted first through Catholic radio, of all things. I stumbled upon, we know now it was not a stumble, it was God incident. But I stumbled upon Catholic radio in Advent, no accident there, of 2010. It was just a few weeks before Christmas. And that was where God first got my attention. And those were where the first seeds were planted that challenged me not only about my position in Planned Parenthood, but the life issue, contraception, all of these things all of these seeds that were beginning to be planted. And little did I know what would happen next. So Christmas came and went, New Year's came and went, and I entered into the new year still listening to Catholic radio on my drive to and from work. So it's probably like the worst thing anybody could do. But it also makes sense why every program that I heard was on the life issues, because this was in January when everyone prepares for the March for Life. And so again, God's perfect timing. So in January of 2011, another piece of the puzzle would be put in place. And that was a series of undercover investigative videos that were put out by Live Action. Anybody familiar with Live Action?
Yes.
Okay. So Live Action had gone undercover at different locations, different Planned Parenthoods across the country. And these undercover investigative videos that they released showed Planned Parenthood employees willing to aid and abet in underage sex trafficking. So they were willing to cover it up. Cecile Richards, who was the president of Planned Parenthood Federation of America, went on television, of course, all the media outlets, and said, these are highly edited videos, these are doctored videos, all the same song and dance we always hear from them whenever they get caught in something. And she also went on to say that they would retrain their entire staff across the country. So I attended this so-called retraining. And as I attended, I thought, okay, this is great because they're going to redeem themselves. Maybe all these negative things I hear about Planned Parenthood isn't true. And as I attended this so-called quote-unquote retraining, the first thing they did was roll the film from these undercover investigative videos. And I'm watching and looking, and I'm trying to look at everyone's faces to get an idea of if everyone's thinking what I'm thinking, right? And so at the end of it all, she says, does anyone have any questions? And I paused and I thought, well, gosh, there's like this big elephant in the room. I have questions. And I raised my hand and I said, well, I get this. This is, what not to do. I'm assuming that's why they were showing it to us, right? Like, this isn't what you should do. And I said, well, as a clinic manager, I'd like to know what policies and procedures that I can take back to my clinic to train my staff. And not just my staff, but I'd like to know myself if something like this actually occurred, what steps do I take? What do I do? What's the protocol? And she said, Ramona, we're not here to talk about that. We're here to train you on how to identify if you're being videotaped, recorded, or entrapped in any way by any undercover investigator. We actually had a wanted poster of Lila Rose on a bulletin board. And she was kind of like that person to watch out for. And it was in that moment that I realized everything that I'd heard up to that point about Planned Parenthood was true. And I was disgusted and I was in shock. I didn't think anything would shock me, but I was shocked. And I thought, my head was spinning, and I thought, I don't know that I can continue to be here, But I hadn't really connected the dots about the issue of abortion. So there wasn't this, conversion on the issue of abortion. That would actually come later. At that point, I'm just kind of like, no, I don't think this place is for me. I don't know that I can represent them anymore. It was actually after that moment, maybe a few days later, or a couple of weeks later, that I'd heard an advertisement on Catholic radio about a group called 40 Days for Life, who would be outside of my facility in Sherman, Texas, praying for 40 days. And that they would kick off on Ash Wednesday, which was in 2011. And I thought, did I hear that right? Sherman, Texas? I mean, Sherman, Texas is, like 30,000 people. I don't even know if most people know where to find Sherman, Texas on the map. I had no idea why people would come out in front of our facility because, first of all, we didn't even perform abortions. And so as the date approached, I kept hearing this advertisement about 40 Days for Life. And one of the things that struck me was this one word, peaceful. Peaceful and prayerful victory. We had always had protesters outside of our facility, and I always felt a little afraid of the quote-unquote protesters. I didn't, they used to kind of yell at the women and things like that, and I always felt uneasy when they were out there. But this was different. I felt reassured by this idea that people would be out there peacefully praying. I thought, okay, well that's different, right? And I had never heard of 40 Days for Life prior to that. It wasn't something anyone ever talked about in our affiliate. And so, and I think it's probably because they don't want to give you attention, right? They don't want to give it attention. And so, I thought, okay, this is interesting. And as the days went by, I was still listening to Catholic radio. And as Lent approached, I felt something heavy on my heart. I felt that God was calling me to prepare for something. And keep in mind, I'm wanting to leave my job. And I thought, well, maybe these people can help. Maybe I can ask them to pray for me. Because, it can't hurt for people to pray for you, right? And in preparation for Lent, I had decided to go back to Mass. I hadn't been in years. I decided to go to confession. Hadn't been in years, so it was a pretty good confession. And and the priest, our parish priest, I was a little afraid of how he would respond to me working for Planned Parenthood, and he said, Ramona, you need to leave your job as soon as possible. And I was like, I'm working on it, And so I left feeling this weight lifted off my shoulders, but I also felt very stressed because I didn't know how I was going to find another job so quickly, and I couldn't quit my job without another job in place. So on the third day of the campaign, I was sitting in my office and I was looking out our big open window, and everyone had left for the day, and I was finishing up all the reports, and I looked across the parking lot and I saw this one woman standing out, just one lone woman standing out on the sidewalk. And I thought to myself, I wonder if she's one of those 40 days for life people. And I thought, maybe today's the day I'll go ask for prayers, because I was trying to build up the courage to go out. And I walked out and I looked at her and she looked at me, and she, we caught each other's eye, and she smiled and she waved at me. I smiled and waved at her, and I jumped in my car and I drove off. I chickened out. And I got about a block away and I realized I'd forgotten the deposit. So I had to go back, and I was trying to talk myself out of going back because it meant I would see her again. So I went back and I tried not to look, you're like, oh, I'm not gonna look at it. And I ran in, got the deposit, and I tried not to look, and I caught her eye again. She waved and she smiled. And suddenly I just felt this kind of this push, and heard this voice say, go. And I went straight to her, and her eyes were wide as saucers, as you can imagine, because poor lady, I don't know if she thought I was going to say something horrible to her. But I just introduced myself, and I just said, will you pray for me? And she looked surprised. I can understand now why. And she said, yes, can I pray for you now? And so she began to pray, and we began to talk. And then at the same time, this gentleman approaches, and he introduces himself as the leader of that vigil, Jerry Brundage. He and I began to talk, and what was beautiful in that moment is that he asked me for permission to share this with the rest of the volunteers. And he said, will you give me permission to tell the others and ask them to pray for you? And I said, yes, that would be great, And I think that was important because he saw me as a person with dignity, and he respected my privacy. So it wasn't like he was going to rush off and tell everyone. He asked for my permission. And that meant that he saw me as a human and not as some trophy to be won. He also shared this with the national team. So there, that got the ball going, right? Everybody's like, oh my gosh, this manager is, wanting to leave. And so as the campaign went on, they asked if they could circulate my resume, maybe try to help me find another job. And of course, I was like, yes, please, I need another job before I can leave. And at the end of the 40 Days for Life campaign, I was still at Planned Parenthood. All that time, I can tell you that there was this huge shift in my life. I can't explain it. I can only say that it was God's grace that poured out. It was like the floodgates of grace poured out from the grace, from the prayers and the fasting from the people who were out on the sidewalk during that 40 Days for Life vigil. I really have no words to describe how I felt. I felt uplifted. I felt joy where before I didn't feel joy. I felt peace where before I didn't. I felt hope where I didn't before. Because you can imagine working for this type of organization, how dark it is and how heavy it is on your soul. And I was never at peace, and I was never joyful. But during that campaign, I was. And at the end of those 40 days, I thought, this was my thinking at the time, I thought something miraculous would happen and I would find some other job. I didn't realize the miracle was happening already. And I thought I would find this other job and I would, leave and go to this job and leave Planned Parenthood behind and just move on with my life. I realized now God had other plans, and he wanted to fully convert me. Because if I had found another job and left, I wouldn't have had a full conversion. So it was actually the Tuesday after Easter that I had gone back to work. We were only open 3 days a week, and I had gone back Tuesday after Easter, and I remember driving home that evening, and I was kind of upset with God, and it was one of the only times that I'd driven home in silence, and I remember feeling abandoned. Number one, 40 days was over, and the people that were praying for me were gone. I was still in contact with the people from National who were trying to continue to encourage me to quit, but I didn't feel their presence out on the sidewalk anymore. And I felt like God had abandoned me despite all the efforts I was making to get right with God. And so as I'm pulling into my driveway at home, I shut off the ignition and I paused for a moment, and then I flipped on the radio. And in that exact moment that I flipped on the radio, this elderly gentleman had just called in, and he was talking about his experience being out on the sidewalk. And at that point, he had been praying in front of his local abortion facility probably 30 plus years. And the radio host responded to him in a way that I will never forget, because it was as if God was speaking to me directly through her. And she said to him, "Thank you, good sir, for all that you do. Thank you for being out on the sidewalk and praying and being a witness for these babies. Because at the end of our lives, we're all going to stand before God. And He's going to ask you, did you know about abortion? He's going to ask you, did you know that babies were being ripped from their mother's wombs, limb by limb, at the rate of over 3,000 a day? And then He's going to ask you, what did you do?" And when she said those words, I was absolutely gutted, because I realized that I could no longer wash my hands of innocent blood. And though I wanted to convince myself that I was in some sort of gray area, I couldn't shake the fact that I was going to stand before God and have to say, "Lord, I referred them. I told them where to go." And in that moment, I just began to sob uncontrollably, and I begged God for His forgiveness for my indifference. Again, had I just quit my job, moved on, I would not have had that moment. I would not have had that moment of realization that I was culpable, that I was involved in the deaths of all of these innocent babies who I referred for abortion, and just for taking a paycheck from this organization. I was being paid with blood money for 3 years of my life. And for me, that was just this beautiful moment of grace and mercy that was poured out to me, so that I could come to that realization and come to full contrition and reconcile fully with God. After that, we attended Mass on Sunday, May the 1st. It was the first Sunday after Easter. I didn't know that this was the Feast of Divine Mercy. I knew nothing about it as a little baby Catholic, because I had just started going back to Mass regularly and learning my faith as a brand new Catholic, essentially. I had no idea about the message of Divine Mercy. I was sitting in the pews with my family, and during the consecration, I heard God say very clearly to me, "Ramona, I forgive you. Have faith in me." And I began to cry, because I realized in that moment God was asking me to take a leap of faith and trust Him, and that this was a matter of life and death, and that my soul was at stake, and I needed to quit my job immediately, and it didn't matter if I had another job in place. He wanted me to trust. So I had made the decision when I returned back to work on Tuesday that Friday, May the 6th, would be my last day at Planned Parenthood, with or without a job. I also didn't know that May the 1st of 2011 was the beatification date of St. John Paul II. So when I went back to work, I had thought, "Lord, protect me in these final days." No one else around me knew what was happening, with the exception of one coworker. I was trying to keep things private and quiet because of what had happened to Abby Johnson, and I thought, well, it's probably best if no one knows what's going on, and I just leave quietly. And on my drive to work that Tuesday, I remember just praying and asking God to protect me in those final days. When I arrived at work, I got a call from administration saying that our nurse practitioner was being moved to another location because someone had called in. And then I was to call all of our patients and reschedule them. So on those final 3 days, no one came into our clinic. I was there alone, and I was able to gather all of my personal belongings without anyone knowing what was happening. And on Friday, May the 6th of 2011, I submitted my letter of resignation and I walked out the door. And little did I know that that yes to God would result in that facility shutting down 3 months later. They went out of business. Praise be to God. Now, God is good. I would love to tell people this is what's going to happen, right? Every 40 days for life vigil. I would love to tell people that you being out here is going to result in the clinic closing. It's going to result in all these babies saved and workers converted and so on and so forth. And I've asked God, why did these things happen the way they did? And the only answer I get, and the only thing that gives me peace, is that I'm meant to share this story. To give it, I guess, a shot in the arm to all of those who sometimes have doubt or sometimes struggle with their own faith and their own belief. St. Mother Teresa said once, God doesn't call me to be successful, He calls me to be faithful. And that's why we're here. Because we're faithful. Because we're people of faith. That's why I do what I'm doing, because God He keeps calling me to it, even though I keep saying I don't want to do it anymore. I didn't plan this. I wasn't planning this for my life. I didn't plan on sharing my story, and yet God kept putting me out there, and putting me out there, and putting me out there. And here I am. And I've asked many times and discerned many times if this is where I'm meant to be. And He keeps saying yes. And here I am. And I think that there's so many beautiful facets to the pro-life movement. But I know that we are nothing without the first foundation, which is what we're doing here for 40 days, 2 times a week. And that's prayer. Without our prayer, without our fasting, without our peaceful outreach, without our presence and our witness, we don't have anything. So all of the beautiful successes, all of the wins, the overturning of Roe v. Wade, that's a result of our prayer. Norman mentioned the 248 babies that have been saved this campaign alone.
Probably 249 by now.
Yeah, probably. It may even be higher than that by now.
Yeah.
And we think about the 248, that number, we think about that number, that's because all of our prayers are unified. You know, oftentimes we want to see it here in front of our eyes, but we have to remember all of our prayers are unified. They all together throughout the whole world. 604 campaigns. 604 campaigns. This is the largest spring campaign ever. And this is post-Roe. We had the largest fall campaign ever. Post-Roe. What does that say? I think it says that we're waking up. People of faith are saying we can't do this anymore. We can't have another 50 years of this. I am so blessed that you're here. I have to tell you, I'll end with this. You guys are my heroes. You guys are my heroes. I wouldn't be here without your yes. Without the yes of Jerry, who chickened out more than once to lead that campaign. And without the yes of that woman who showed up on the sidewalk, who I found out wasn't even part of that 40 Days for Life vigil. God had put it on her heart that day to come out and pray, and she'd never prayed in her life in front of any abortion facility or Planned Parenthood. And I realized that had she not said yes, no one would have been there, because Jerry was running late. He was caught up at work. And if he had not been there, Jerry wasn't there, she hadn't been there, no one would have been there when I finally found the courage to go out and ask for prayers. That's God, guys. When the Holy Spirit puts something in our heart, we have to say yes. We have to respond. We have to act. And you're acting, and you're here. And I thank you. God bless you, and keep up the good fight. You have questions?
Well, you told the story of working at Pennacook. Of course, the first thoughts that entered my life.